I walked into the house carrying my grandmother's pecan pie, only to find my seat had vanished as if I never existed. 23 relatives sat shoulder to shoulder, yet no one said a word. My mother offered a cold, practiced smile and told me there was no seat for disappointments. I didn't cry. I simply placed an envelope on my father's plate and told them I finally understood why they wanted me gone. And now I knew exactly what I was going to erase in return. My name is Sadie Livingston, and the last time I walked through the front door of my parents' house in Kestrel Hollow, Pennsylvania, I was 33 years old. It was the fourth Thursday in November, a day the rest of the country dedicated to gratitude and gluttony, but which the Livingston family dedicated to performance art. I carried a pecan pie in my hands. It was still warm, the bottom of the cardboard box radiating a gentle heat against my palms that fought the biting chill of the late autumn air. This was not a store-bought gesture. I had spent 6 hours the previous day shelling pecans, rolling out the dough until it was translucent but unbroken, and watching the oven temperature like a hawk. It was my grandmother Lillian's recipe. It was the only thing authentic that would enter that house today. The driveway was lined with cars. I recognized the luxury sedans of my uncles and the sleek sports cars of my cousins. The windows of the house glowed with that perfect, warm amber light that suggests a sanctuary, the kind of light you see in commercials for life insurance or expensive coffee. From the outside, it was a masterpiece of domestic stability. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening. I could hear the hum of conversation, the clinking of expensive crystal, the low rumble of laughter that sounded confident and secure. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and opened the door. The hallway smelled of sage, roasted turkey, and expensive perfume. It was the smell of my childhood, a scent that used to mean safety, but now just triggered a tightening in my chest, a primal warning system that evolution had designed for predators, but I used for relatives. I hung my coat on the rack, careful not to disturb the cashmere scarves and wool trenches of the guests who were actually welcome, and walked toward the dining room. The conversation did not die down gradually. It was severed. As my boots hit the threshold of the dining room, the silence swept across the room like a physical wave. Starting from the head of the table and rushing to the foot, forks froze halfway to mouths. Wine glasses were lowered slowly to the table. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I stood there, clutching the pie box, and looked at the tableau before me. The dining table had been extended to its maximum length, stretching from the bay window almost to the kitchen archway. It was set with the gold-rimmed china that my mother, Patricia, only brought out when she wanted to prove something. The centerpiece was a sprawling arrangement of autumn leaves, pumpkins, and candles that probably cost more than my first car. I scanned the perimeter of the table. I saw my Aunt Renee, who looked down at her lap immediately. I saw my cousins, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I saw my sister, Madeline, sitting to the right of my father, glowing with the radiance of the golden child, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, and then I counted the chairs. 1, 2, 3. I did the math in my head. Then I did it again. 23 people were present. 23 chairs were tucked neatly under the table. I looked for my name card. My mother was famous for her calligraphy. She believed that assigned seating was the architecture of a successful social event. I saw cards for distant cousins I hadn't seen in 5 years. I saw a card for Madeline's husband. I saw a card for the newborn baby in a bassinet in the corner. But as I looked at the space between Aunt Renee and my father, the spot where I had sat for every Thanksgiving of my adult life, I saw something that chilled me more than the November wind. There was no gap. Usually, if a guest is late, there's an empty chair, a void waiting to be filled, a place setting waiting for its owner. But today, the chairs had been spaced out with geometric precision. The china had been arranged to fill the surface area perfectly. The table was complete. It was a closed circle. The absence of my seat was not an oversight. It was an architectural decision. It was a renovation of the family structure that had been executed with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. I looked up from the table and met my mother's eyes. Patricia Livingston sat at the opposite end of the table, flanked by the people she approved of. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look apologetic. She looked serene, like a queen who had just signed a difficult but necessary execution order. She took a sip of her wine, set the glass down with a delicate click, and delivered the line that would sever the final tether holding me to this family. There is no seat for disappointments. Sadie. Her voice was not loud. It was conversational, level, and utterly devoid of warmth. It carried across the room clearly, ensuring that every single one of the 23 witnesses heard the verdict. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. It was the kind of silence where you can hear the house settling, the wood groaning under the weight of the tension. In another life, perhaps a younger version of me would have cried. The Sadie of 10 years ago would have begged. The Sadie of 5 years ago would have screamed, demanded an explanation, made a scene that would have justified their exclusion of me. But the woman standing in the doorway today was none of those people. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. It was the numbness of a soldier who realizes the ambush has finally happened, and there is no longer any need to be afraid of the surprise. I didn't say a word. I didn't tremble. I simply walked forward. The sound of my boots on the hardwood floor was a rhythmic, solitary drumbeat. Click, click, click. I walked past my cousins, who shrank back as if I were contagious. I walked past Madeline, who was studying the tablecloth with intense fascination. I walked all the way to the head of the table. I stopped beside my father, Douglas. He was staring at his plate, his knife and fork resting in the classic pause position. He was a man who had built a career on negotiation and conflict resolution. Yet in his own dining room, he could not lift his head. He could not look at his daughter. The top of his head was balding, and I noticed a few age spots on his hands that hadn't been there the last time I saw him. He looked small. I shifted the pie box to my left arm. With my right hand, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I felt the texture of the envelope. It was thick, heavy linen paper, sealed not with glue, but with a wax stamp that had been broken and resealed. Inside that envelope lay the absolute destruction of the peace they were trying so desperately to maintain. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't a plea for money. It was a dossier. It contained a document stamped with the logo of a genetic testing laboratory and a handwritten letter on stationery that smelled of lavender and old age. My mother watched my hand. For a split second, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but calculation. She was wondering what weapon I had brought to a knife fight. I placed the envelope gently on my father's dinner plate, right on top of the porcelain design, covering the slice of turkey he hadn't touched. The white envelope looked stark against the dark gravy. I looked at my father's profile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dad," I said softly. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. I turned my head slightly to address the room, but my eyes locked on my mother. She was still smiling that frozen, superior smile, but the corners of it were starting to twitch. "I understand now," I said. My voice was steady, dropping an octave lower than my usual speaking tone. It wasn't the voice of a daughter. It was the voice of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "I finally understand why you all tried so hard to erase me from this family, why there is no chair, why there is no name card." I paused. I let the words hang in the air, mixing with the smell of the food they wouldn't be able to stomach in 5 minutes. "And I also understand what I'm going to erase in return." I tapped the envelope with my index finger. The sound was dry and paper-thin, but in that room, it sounded like a gavel strike. "I am the proof of a lie," I whispered. The reaction was microscopic, but devastating. My father's hand spasmed on the table. Aunt Renee gasped, a short, sharp intake of air that she tried to smother with her napkin. My mother's smile vanished, replaced by a look of sudden, sharp clarity. She knew. Somewhere in the dark recesses of her carefully constructed life, She realized that the one variable she hadn't accounted for had just walked through the door. I looked around the table one last time. I looked at the faces of the people who shared my last name, the people who had watched me grow up, the people who were currently prioritizing their comfort over my existence. Not one of them stood up. Not one of them offered me a chair from the kitchen. Not one of them said, "Patricia, that is enough." They were complicit. Their silence was a signature on the contract my mother had written. I adjusted my grip on the pie box. "Enjoy the dinner," I said. "You have plenty to talk about now." I turned on my heel and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't slam the door. I closed it with a soft, definitive click, leaving them sealed inside with the truth I had just served them. In my car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and let the silence catch up to me. The envelope on Douglas's plate had been the trigger, not the explosion. The explosion was still in my bag. I pulled over a few blocks away, under a streetlight that made everything look too honest, and I took out the second package, sealed, official, heavy with consequences. I didn't open it at the table. I didn't give them the satisfaction of watching me shake. I opened it here, alone, where the truth could land without an audience. The report inside was clinical and merciless. Names, dates, signatures. A result that didn't just say 0%, it pointed directly at who my real father was. And suddenly Gavin's warning made perfect sense. Now I had both pieces. As I walked back down the driveway, the cold air felt different. It didn't bite anymore. It felt clean. It felt like cleansing fire. But to understand why a daughter would walk into a Thanksgiving dinner with a grenade in her pocket, you cannot start at the dinner itself. You cannot start with the missing chair or the cruel words. Those were just the symptoms of the disease. The infection had started long before today, before the envelope, before the pie, before the silence. Everything started at the funeral. It started exactly 6 months ago, with the smell of lilies and floor wax, and a secret that refused to stay buried in the ground. 6 months before I destroyed Thanksgiving, I was standing in the lobby of the Oak Haven Funeral Home, trying to scrub the smell of industrial floor wax and aggressive lilies out of my nose. If grief had a scent, it was not the salty smell of tears. It was the chemical cloying sweetness of a room designed to mask decay. It was barely 8 in the morning. The service for my grandmother Lillian was not scheduled to begin until 10, but I had arrived early. I wanted to be there before the performance began. I wanted a moment to touch the cold wood of the casket, to fix the hem of the velvet drape, to whisper a goodbye that didn't have to be performed for an audience. I wanted to be a granddaughter, not a prop. But my mother, Patricia, was already there. She was standing by the main entrance, directing 2 terrified-looking interns with the sharp, choppy hand movements of a traffic cop. She was wearing a black dress that cost more than my car, tailored to within an inch of its life. Her hair was a helmet of blonde perfection, not a single strand out of place. There were no red rims around her eyes. There was no puffiness. She looked ready to host a board meeting, not bury her mother. When I walked in, she didn't hug me. She didn't reach out for comfort. She glanced at her wrist, checking a watch I knew was vintage Cartier. "You're early," she said. It was an accusation, not a greeting. "I wanted to help," I said. Stepping forward, I reached for a stack of memorial pamphlets sitting on a side table. "I can set up the flowers near the altar." Or, "Don't touch those," Patricia snapped. She smoothed the stack I had almost disturbed. "The florists have a specific symmetry in mind. We don't need you cluttering the visual." She looked me up and down. I was wearing a simple black dress, respectful, modest, but under her gaze, I felt like I was wearing a clown suit. She picked a piece of invisible lint off my shoulder with a grimace. "If you want to be useful, Sadie, stand by the door," she said, pointing to a podium that held the heavy, leather-bound guest book. "Ensure people sign their full names and addresses. We need the data for the thank you cards. And try not to slouch. It reflects poorly on the family." I stood frozen. "Mom, I want to sit with you guys. I want to—" "We have people to handle the seating," she interrupted. turning her back to me to shout a correction at a florist. "Just manage the book. It is the least you can do." So, I became the doorman. For the next 2 hours, I stood by the entrance as the town of Kestrel Hollow poured in. I handed pens to distant relatives who looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. I nodded at neighbors who offered generic condolences, their eyes scanning the room for the important Livingstons. I was the gatekeeper, but I was not allowed inside the castle. Then, Madeline arrived. My sister did not walk. She floated. She arrived 20 minutes before the service started, stepping out of her husband's Audi like she was stepping onto a red carpet. She was 5 years younger than me, but she carried herself with the assurance of someone who has never been told no in her entire life. She was weeping softly, a delicate, photogenic crying that didn't ruin her makeup but signaled appropriate devastation. Patricia abandoned her post at the altar instantly. She rushed down the aisle, her heels clicking on the marble, and wrapped Madeline in a fierce, protective embrace. "Oh, my poor darling," I heard my mother say, her voice thick with an emotion she hadn't shown me in 3 decades. I know how much she meant to you." I stood 5 feet away, holding a ballpoint pen. Grandma Lillian had meant the world to me. I was the one who drove her to chemotherapy. I was the one who sat with her on Tuesday nights to watch old movies because everyone else was too busy. Madeline had visited twice a year, usually when she needed a check signed, but looking at them, you would think Madeline was the one who had lost a limb. My father, Douglas, walked in behind them. He gave me a quick, tight nod, the kind of acknowledgement you give a coworker you don't know very well in the hallway, and then joined the huddle around Madeline. They moved as a unit, a 3-person phalanx of grief and solidarity, moving toward the front of the room. I waited until the lobby cleared. Then I closed the guest book and followed them. The chapel was full. The air was heavy and hot. I walked down the center aisle, my eyes fixed on the empty space in the front pew next to my father. There was a spot there. It was natural. The nuclear family sits together. That is how funerals work. I reached the front row. I started to slide in next to Dad. Patricia's hand shot out. It was lightning fast, gripping my forearm with a strength that would have left a bruise if I had pulled away. "Not here," she hissed. Her voice was a whisper, but it hit me like a slap. I blinked, confused. "What? Mom, it's the family pew." "This row is for immediate family and the pallbearers," she said, her eyes hard as flint. "We are tight on space. You are sitting in the 3rd row, with Aunt Renee and the cousins." "Immediate family?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "I am your daughter." "Sadie, don't make a scene," Madeline whispered from the other side of my father, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Not today. Please don't make this about you." My father didn't look up. He studied the grain of the wooden pew in front of him. A coward in a 3-piece suit. I looked at the empty space next to him. It wasn't tight on space. There was clearly room for one more person. But the message was not about physics. It was about hierarchy. I pulled my arm from my mother's grip. I turned around, my face burning with a humiliation that felt hotter than the room, and walked back to the 3rd row. I sat down next to a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 4 years. I watched the backs of their heads for the next hour. I watched my mother lean her head on Madeline's shoulder. I watched my father hold Madeline's hand. I sat 10 feet behind them, but I might as well have been on the moon. The service was a blur of platitudes. The eulogy, delivered by the local pastor, spoke of Lillian's generosity, her status in the community, her grace. It didn't mention her sharp wit or the way she hated burnt toast. It was a generic speech for a generic woman, approved by Patricia. When it was over, the crowd began to shuffle toward the reception hall next door. I waited for the aisle to clear, feeling a heavy, dull stone in my stomach. I didn't want to go to the reception. I didn't want to eat cold sandwiches and pretend I belonged to these people. "Ms. Livingston? Sadie Livingston?" The voice came from the shadows of the side alcove, near the emergency exit. I turned. A man was standing there, holding a leather briefcase. He looked to be in his late 60s, with silver hair and a suit that was out of fashion but impeccably maintained. He looked like a character from a black and white movie, serious and solid. "Yes," I said. "I am Gavin Holt," he said. He didn't offer a handshake, likely sensing I wasn't in the mood for social niceties. "I was your grandmother's personal attorney, not the family attorney. Hers." I frowned. "I thought Mr. Henderson handled the estate. The will was read last week." I remembered that reading vividly. It had been brief. My mother inherited the estate, the house, and the antique collection. Madeline received a lump sum of $50,000 and the jewelry collection. I had received a box of old books and a porcelain tea set. I hadn't cared about the money, but the disparity was just another reminder of where I stood. "Mr. Henderson handled the public estate," Gavin said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was barely audible over the organ music playing the exit recessional. "Lillian had a separate arrangement with me, a private arrangement." He opened his briefcase. He didn't pull out a document. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. "She left this for you," Gavin said. I reached for it, but he pulled it back slightly. "There are conditions. Sadie," he said. His eyes were intense, searching my face. "Your grandmother was very specific. This is not a bequest. It is not a gift. It is an instruction." "I don't understand," I said. "Why didn't this come up at the reading?" "Because Lillian did not want your mother to know it existed," Gavin said. He dropped the bomb casually, as if discussing the weather. "She instructed me to give this to you privately, away from the house, and only after the funeral was concluded." He held the envelope out again. This time, I took it. It felt heavy, heavier than paper should feel. "You are not to open it yet," Gavin said. I looked at him, bewildered. "What?" "The instructions are clear," he said. "You are to take this home, you are to keep it safe, and you are to wait exactly 6 months from today before breaking that seal." "6 months?" I asked. "Why? What is in here?" Gavin looked over my shoulder, checking to make sure we were alone. The last of the mourners were drifting out the front doors. The funeral home was quiet again, returning to its natural state of silence. "Verification," Gavin said. "Lillian initiated a process before she died. A query. The results of that query will not be finalized for another few months. Whatever is in that envelope, she wanted to make sure the supporting evidence was irrefutable before you saw it." "Evidence of what?" I demanded. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. "Is this about money? Is it a trust fund?" Gavin's expression softened. Just a fraction. He looked at me with something that might have been pity. "It is not money. Sadie, if it were money, your mother would have found a way to take it already." He closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. "Lillian told me something the day she signed this over to me," he said. "She said she was worried about you. She said she was afraid that once she was gone, you would be silenced. She said you were the one who carried the burden, and she didn't want you carrying the lie." "What lie?" I whispered. "I don't know the details." Gavin lied. I could tell he was lying. Lawyers always know. "But I know that she wanted you to have a weapon. That is what you are holding. Not a letter. A weapon." He checked his watch. 6 months. Sadie, do not open it early. If you do, you won't have the full picture, and they will tear you apart. Wait for the second package I will send you. When the 2 pieces come together, you will understand." He tipped his head, turned, and walked out the side door, vanishing into the parking lot. I stood alone in the empty chapel. The smell of lilies was suffocating now. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. It was smooth and cool to the touch. She was afraid you would be silenced. I thought about the seating chart. I thought about the guest book. I thought about the 33 years of being the difficult one, the disappointment, the outsider in my own bloodline. I had walked into this funeral home feeling like I had lost my only ally. I had felt untethered, drifting in a sea of people who tolerated me at best. But now, I held something solid. My grandmother hadn't just left me a tea set. She had left me a time bomb, and she had set the timer for 6 months. I slipped the envelope into my purse, right next to the car keys. I zipped it shut. I could feel the weight of it against my hip. I walked out of the chapel and headed toward the reception hall where my family was waiting. I would eat their sandwiches. I would stand in the back. I would let my mother look through me and let Madeline preen in the spotlight. I would let them treat me like a ghost, because ghosts are invisible, and invisible people are the best at hiding things. I walked into the bright light of the reception, clutching my purse, carrying the secret that would eventually leave 23 chairs empty and one chair finally, permanently filled. I did not wake up one morning and decide to be the family martyr. It was not a conscious choice, like picking a major in college or deciding to cut your hair short. It was a slow, creeping erosion, like water wearing down a stone until the stone forgets it was ever a mountain. I was 24 years old when I learned that my dreams were considered optional, while my sister's whims were considered mandatory. I had just been accepted into a graduate program in Chicago. I had a deposit down on a studio apartment that smelled of lemon polish and old wood. I had a life packed into cardboard boxes, ready to be taped shut. And then the phone rang. It was my father, Douglas. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask about the move. He simply said that Mom was sick, that it was aggressive, and that they needed help. I expected him to hire a nurse. I expected him to call Aunt Renee. Instead, he called me. I was the one who broke my lease. I was the one who called the university and explained that I had to defer. A deferral that eventually turned into a withdrawal. I was the one who drove 400 miles back to Kestrel Hollow, unpacked my boxes in my childhood bedroom, and put my life on a shelf where it would gather dust for the next 2 years. Madeline was 19 then. She was a sophomore in college, pledging a sorority that required her to wear pearl earrings and drink terrible wine. When I asked if Madeline would be coming home to help, my mother looked at me from her hospital bed, her face pale but her resolve ironclad, and said that we could not interrupt Madeline's life. She said Madeline was in a delicate transition. She said Madeline's future was fragile and needed to be protected. So, I became the buffer. I drove to the chemotherapy appointments while Madeline went to spring break in Cabo. I sat in waiting rooms reading 3-year-old magazines while Madeline posted photos of her new boyfriend. I learned how to flush a PICC line and how to manage nausea medication, while Madeline learned how to mix the perfect margarita. I did not resent the work itself. I loved my mother, or at least, I desperately wanted to love her enough to make her love me back. I thought that if I sacrificed enough, if I bled enough time and energy onto the altar of her recovery, she would finally look at me and see a daughter. I thought the sweat and the sleepless nights were a currency I could use to buy my way into the inner circle. I was wrong when my mother finally went into remission. There was a party. It was a grand affair in the garden, with catered food and a string quartet. Everyone raised a glass to Patricia's strength. They toasted Douglas's devotion. They hugged Madeline and told her how brave she must have been to study so hard while her mother was ill. I was in the kitchen, washing the champagne flutes because the catering staff was short-handed, and my mother did not want spots on the crystal. I watched through the swinging door as Madeline laughed, her head thrown back, basking in the adoration of the room. She was the survivor's daughter. I was just the staff. That was the moment the dynamic calcified. The cement dried, and I was stuck in the foundation while they lived in the penthouse. I moved out a month later, but I never really escaped. I took a job at Hawthorne and Vale Community Services. It was not the glamorous career I had envisioned in Chicago, but it was real work. I became a case manager for families in crisis. I spent my days navigating bureaucracy, fighting for housing vouchers, and sitting with people who had lost everything. I was good at it. I was good at it because I knew what it felt like to be invisible, and I knew how to clean up messes that other people had made. My colleagues at Hawthorne and Vale respected me. They saw a woman who was organized, compassionate, and fiercely protective of her clients. But to my family, my job was just another sign of my mediocrity. Social work, my mother would say at dinner parties, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. Sadie has always been drawn to the Unfortunate. It is very noble, in a way. She made it sound like I was collecting stray cats, not helping human beings survive. Despite living 40 minutes away, I was never allowed to be fully independent. The phone would ring, and the summons would come. Sadie. The caterer canceled for the Christmas party. We need you to cook. Sadie. Aunt Renee needs a ride to the airport at 4 in the morning. Douglas needs his sleep. Sadie. Madeline is moving apartments. We need your truck. I always said yes. I said yes because I was trained to say yes. I was the utility player. I was the spare tire you keep in the trunk. Dirty, ignored, but essential when the road gets rough. And just like a spare tire, the moment the emergency was over, I was shoved back into the dark. The only person who saw the transactional nature of my existence was my grandmother. Lillian. Lillian was not like them. She was sharp, observant, and she did not care about the optics of a perfect family. She cared about the truth. In those years after I moved out, she became my refuge. I would go to her house on Sunday afternoons, not out of obligation, but because it was the only place where I could breathe without sucking in my stomach. I remember one afternoon vividly. It was about a year before she died. We were sitting in her sunroom, drinking tea that was too strong. Surrounded by her collection of African violets, I had just come from my parents' house. I was exhausted. I had spent the entire weekend helping them clean out the garage because they wanted to turn it into a home gym for Madeline, who had decided she wanted to get into fitness modeling that month. My hands were covered in dust, and my back ached. Lillian looked at me over the rim of her cup. Her eyes were a piercing, watery blue, surrounded by a map of wrinkles that told the story of 80 years of no-nonsense living. "You look like a ghost." "Sadie," she said. "I'm fine, Grandma," I said, reciting the script. "Just tired. Work is busy." "It is not work," she said. She set her cup down with a clatter. "It is them. They are eating you alive, piece by piece." I looked away, staring at a blooming violet. "Their family. They need help." "They don't need help," Lillian snapped. "They need servants, and they have appointed you the head housekeeper of their lives." She reached across the small table and took my hand. Her skin was paper-thin, warm and dry. "Why do you do it, Sadie?" she asked. "Why do you let Patricia treat you like an unpaid intern? You are smarter than her. You are kinder than her. Why do you beg for scraps at her table?" "Because she's my mother," I said, my voice cracking. "And I don't know what I did to make her hate me so much. I just want to fix it. If I do enough, maybe she'll forgive me for whatever I did wrong." Lillian squeezed my hand hard. It was a grip of surprising strength. "That is just it," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You didn't do anything wrong. That is the tragedy of it." She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "Your mother is not punishing you for your mistakes, Sadie. She is punishing you for her own. She looks at you, and she sees a sin she committed 30 years ago. She hates you because you are the living proof of something she wants to forget." I froze. The air in the sunroom seemed to stop moving. "What do you mean?" I asked. "What sin?" Lillian hesitated. For a moment, she looked like she was going to tell me everything right then and there. Her mouth opened, and I saw the truth hovering on her lips. But then she pulled back. She looked at the door, as if afraid Patricia might burst in. Even though my mother was miles away, "It is not my story to tell," Lillian said, retreating into her chair. "Not yet, but you need to know this. Sadie, you are not the disappointment. You are the collateral damage." I didn't push her. I didn't demand answers. I was a coward. I was afraid that if I pulled that thread, the whole sweater would unravel, and I would be left with nothing. I was terrified that the sin she mentioned was something that would make me even more unlovable. So I drank my tea, and I let the silence fill the room. I went back to my life. I went back to Hawthorne and Vale. I went back to fixing other people's problems while ignoring the structural rot in my own foundation. But Lillian's words stayed with me. Collateral damage. When she died, the grief was not a sharp, stabbing pain. It was a dull, heavy suffocation. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Standing at her grave, watching the casket lower into the ground, I realized that she was the only person on earth who had ever looked at me and seen me. Not just a useful object. Without her, I was unmoored. I was a boat without an anchor, drifting in a storm that my mother controlled. And then came the envelope. For 6 months, it sat in the top drawer of my nightstand, buried under a stack of old birthday cards and spare change. It was a physical presence in my apartment. I could feel it through the wood of the drawer. Gavin Holt had called it a weapon. Every night, before I went to sleep, I would think about opening it. I would think about breaking the wax seal and reading the words that Lillian had been too afraid to say to my face, but I didn't. I waited because I was afraid. I was afraid that the envelope would confirm what I had always suspected in my darkest moments, that I really was worthless, that there was a valid reason for my exclusion. But I also waited because of what Gavin had said about timing, verification. As the months ticked by, the dynamic with my family grew worse. Emboldened by Lillian's absence, my mother's cruelty became sharper, more overt. The Thanksgiving invitation was the final straw. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to labor. "Come early," she had said on the phone, 5 days before the holiday. "The caterers are charging extra for setup, so I told them not to bother. You can do the table, and bring that pie. But don't make the crust too thick this time." She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was bringing anyone. She just assumed I would be there, ready to serve, ready to take my place in the shadows while Madeline shone. That night, exactly 5 days before Thanksgiving, I opened the drawer. I took out the envelope. The 6 months were up. The second package from Gavin had arrived that morning. A simple manila folder containing the final piece of the puzzle. I sat on the edge of my bed, the streetlights from outside casting long, distorted shadows across my room. My hands were trembling, not from cold, but from the terrifying realization that I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. I broke the wax. It made a sharp, cracking sound, like a small bone snapping. I pulled out the papers. I read the letter from Lillian first. Then I read the lab report. Then I read the birth certificate copy with the blacked-out line. The world did not end with a bang. It ended with the quiet rustle of paper. Lillian had been right. It wasn't my fault. It had never been my fault. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The sadness that had weighed me down for 33 years began to evaporate, replaced by something hotter, something harder. I wasn't a disappointment. I was a secret. I looked at the phone. I could have called them. I could have screamed at my mother. I could have demanded an explanation right then. But I didn't. I thought about the table setting my mother wanted me to arrange. I thought about the pie she wanted me to bake. I thought about the chair she probably wouldn't even bother to set out for me. I put the papers back in the envelope. I would go to Thanksgiving. I would bake the pie. I would play the part of the dutiful, dull Sadie one last time. But this time, I wouldn't be looking for a seat at their table. I would be bringing a wrecking ball to destroy the whole dining room. The countdown was over. The weapon was loaded. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the explosion. I was the one holding the match. The phone call from Gavin Holt came exactly 6 months to the day after the funeral. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky outside my office window a flat. Bruised gray that promised snow but delivered only freezing rain. I was staring at a spreadsheet, trying to focus on a housing grant allocation. When my cell phone buzzed against the desk surface, the sound was like an angry hornet in the quiet room. I knew who it was before I looked. Mr. Holt did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply told me that the date had arrived. He told me he was parked outside my apartment building and that he would wait for me to get off work. He said the handover had to be done in person. He said he would not leave the package in a mailbox or with a doorman. The rest of the workday blurred into a series of meaningless motions. I typed emails I did not remember writing. I nodded at colleagues whose faces seemed to be underwater. All I could hear was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second dragging me closer to a revelation I was not sure I survived. When I pulled into my parking spot at 5:30, Gavin's black sedan was waiting. He stepped out as I approached, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked older than I remembered from the funeral, his face etched with the fatigue of a man who carries too many secrets for too many dead people. He handed me the envelope. It was thick. It was heavier than it had any right to be. The paper was a creamy, expensive stock that felt like fabric under my fingertips. On the back, sealed with a glob of dark red wax that looked uncomfortably like dried blood, was my grandmother's handwriting. The loops were shaky, lacking the crisp authority she had possessed in her prime, but the message was clear. When you are ready for the truth, Gavin did not say good luck. He did not tell me to be brave. He just looked at me with those sad, knowing eyes, nodded once, and got back into his car. He drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot with the wind cutting through my coat and a grenade in my hand. I took it upstairs. I placed it in the center of my kitchen table. I stared at it for 3 hours. I did not open it. Fear is a strange thing. It does not always manifest as panic. Sometimes, it manifests as paralysis. For 33 years, I had lived with a specific kind of pain. It was the pain of being the outsider, the disappointment, the one who did not quite fit the mold. But it was a familiar pain. It was a pain I knew how to navigate. I knew where the sharp edges were. I knew which floorboards in the family dynamic would creak if I stepped on them. This envelope threatened to trade that familiar pain for something unknown. If I opened it, I could never go back to not knowing. If I broke that wax seal, I would be destroying the only version of reality I had ever known. Even a miserable reality is hard to let go of when it is the only roof over your head. So, I took the envelope off the table. I walked into my bedroom and shoved it into the back of my nightstand drawer, burying it under a stack of old journals I never read. I told myself I was just waiting for the right moment. I told myself I was too tired from work. I lied to myself. I left it there for 5 days. The envelope sat in the drawer, radiating a silent pressure that I could feel even when I was in the other room. It was like a heartbeat in the walls. Thump, thump, thump. Then came the call. It was 5 days before Thanksgiving. I was in my kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug. When the phone rang, the screen flashed, "Mom." I answered, bracing myself for the usual critique of my life choices or a passive-aggressive comment about my job. "Sadie," my mother said. There was no greeting, no question about my health. Her voice was brisk, efficient, the tone of a project manager speaking to a subcontractor. "We have changed the schedule. You need to be here an hour early on Thursday." "Hello to you too, Mom," I said, leaning against the counter. "Why the change? I thought dinner was at 4. "It is," she said, ignoring my sarcasm. "But the table needs to be set properly. Madeline is bringing the baby's bassinet into the dining room, so we have to rearrange the sideboard. I need someone to move the heavy china and polish the silver. Your father has a bad back, and I certainly cannot be lifting crates of silverware in my dress." "Can't Madeline help?" I asked. It was a reflex question. I knew the answer before I asked it. "Don't be ridiculous," Patricia snapped. "Madeline is exhausted. The baby is teething. Besides, she needs to save her energy. She has a big announcement to make at dinner, and she wants everything to be perfect." "What announcement?" I asked. "You will hear it with everyone else," she said. "Just be here at 2, and wear something appropriate. Last year you looked like you were going to a funeral." She hung up. I stood there, holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. "Just be here. Move the heavy things. Polish the silver. Don't look like a funeral." My thumb hovered over the Instagram app on my phone. I shouldn't have looked. I knew it would only make the acid in my stomach churn. But I opened it anyway. There it was, the first post on my feed. It was a photo of Madeline. She was sitting in a sunlit nursery, wearing a flowing white dress that made her look like a Madonna painting. She was holding a tiny pair of knit booties in one hand and touching her stomach with the other. The caption read, "So excited to share our next chapter with the family this Thanksgiving. God has blessed us again. Grateful blessed family." First, the comments were a waterfall of adoration. "You're glowing. Best mom ever. Can't wait to celebrate with you." I looked at the photo. It was staged perfectly. The lighting, the outfit, the angle. It was a production. And then I looked at the background of the photo. In the corner of the frame, blurred out but visible if you knew what to look for, was a stack of boxes. They were the boxes I had packed for her last week when she decided she needed to turn the guest room into a second nursery. I had spent 4 hours taping those boxes and hauling them to the storage unit while she directed me from the couch. I was in the picture, but only as the invisible labor that made her perfection possible. I realized then what Thanksgiving was going to be. It wasn't a family dinner, it was a stage play. Madeline was the lead actress. My mother was the director. My father was the producer. And me? I wasn't even in the cast. I was the stagehand. I was the prop master. I was the one who swept the stage before the curtain went up so the stars wouldn't get dust on their shoes. They needed me there an hour early, not because they wanted my company, but because they needed someone to build the set. They needed a backdrop. And a backdrop is not supposed to speak. A backdrop is not supposed to have feelings. A backdrop is just supposed to hold up the scenery and stay out of the light. Rage is usually described as hot, red, fiery, burning, but this rage was cold. It was the temperature of liquid nitrogen. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips, freezing the shaking that had been there since Gavin gave me the envelope. I put the phone down on the counter. The glass screen made a sharp clack against the granite. I walked into my bedroom. I didn't hesitate this time. I walked straight to the nightstand and pulled the drawer open so hard the wood screeched against the runners. I took out the envelope. I sat on the edge of my bed. The room was dark, lit only by the street lamp outside, casting long prison bar shadows across the duvet. I ran my thumb over the red wax seal. It was cool and hard. It represented 6 months of silence. It represented a lifetime of being the other. I hooked my finger under the flap of the envelope. I pulled. The sound was violent. The wax didn't just crumble. It snapped with a sharp, dry crack that sounded exactly like a finger bone breaking. The paper tore with a high-pitched rip. I reached inside. There were 3 documents. The first was a letter on my grandmother's stationery. The paper was old, smelling faintly of the lavender sachets she used to keep in her desk. "My dearest Sadie," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have been brave enough to ask the question that I was too cowardly to answer while I was alive." I skipped the preamble. My eyes raced down the page, hungry for the data, for the fact that would anchor me. "I have watched you suffer in this house for 30 years. Lillian wrote, "I have watched them treat you like a stranger. I always suspected why, but I needed proof. I needed to know if my daughter was simply cruel, or if she was protecting a secret so dark she was willing to sacrifice her own child to keep it. I hired a private investigator 2 years ago. We collected samples. It was not difficult. A hairbrush from the guest room, a glass of water from a family dinner. I turned the page. My hands were steady now. The trembling was gone. The second document was a report from a genetic testing laboratory in Philadelphia. It was full of charts and numbers, columns of alleles and markers that meant nothing to me. But at the bottom of the page, there was a summary paragraph written in plain English. Subject A, Sadie Livingston. Subject B, Douglas Livingston. I scanned to the conclusion, probability of paternity, 0%. I stopped breathing. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I read it again. 0%. Not low probability, not inconclusive, 0. I looked at the third document. It was a photocopy of my birth certificate. I had seen my birth certificate before. Of course, I needed it for my driver's license, for my job. But the one I had always seen listed Douglas Livingston as my father. This one was different. This was a copy of the original long-form application. the one filed at the hospital before the official certificate was typed up. In the space for father's name, someone had used a thick black marker to cross out the entry. The ink was heavy, aggressive, but the person who had done it, my mother, presumably, had been in a rush, or perhaps in a panic. The black line didn't quite cover the bottom loops of the letters. I held the paper up to the light of the street lamp. I squinted, trying to read the ghost of the handwriting beneath the redaction. I couldn't make out the name. It was too thoroughly obliterated, but I didn't need the name to understand the reality. Douglas Livingston was not my father. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. I actually gasped, a wet, ragged sound in the empty room. It wasn't that I didn't belong. It was that I had never belonged. All those years of trying to earn his approval, all those years of wondering why he looked at Madeline with pride and looked at me with a vague, uncomfortable tolerance. He wasn't emotionally distant because he was a stoic man. He was distant because every time he looked at me, he saw a stranger. And my mother didn't hate me because I was messy or loud or unsuccessful. She hated me because I was evidence. I was a walking, talking billboard for an affair she had desperately tried to bury. Every time I sat at her table, I was a reminder of a betrayal. No seat for disappointments. She wasn't calling me a disappointment. She was calling me a mistake. I looked back at the lab report. 0%. A strange, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle it. Tears pricked my eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. I wasn't defective. I wasn't the black sheep because I had failed to be white enough. I was a different species entirely. I stood up. The papers fell to the floor, scattering around my feet like autumn leaves. I walked to the mirror on the back of my bedroom door. I looked at my reflection. I looked at my eyes, my chin, the shape of my nose. I had spent my whole life looking for Douglas in my face, looking for Patricia in my smile. Now, looking in the mirror, I saw a blank canvas. I saw a mystery. I looked down at the letter from Lillian again. There was a postscript I had missed. Do not let them bury this. Sadie, they stole your seat at the table because they were afraid you would take the whole house. Go back there, take what is yours, and do not let them interrupt you. I picked up the papers. I folded them carefully. I didn't put them back in the envelope. I walked to my closet and pulled out my work bag, the sturdy leather tote I used for court appearances. I slid the documents into the hidden zippered compartment at the bottom. Then I walked back to the kitchen. I picked up the phone. I didn't call my mother back. I didn't call Madeline. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Thanksgiving was in 5 days. Okay, I said to the empty apartment. My voice was low, steady, and dangerous. You want me to set the table? Fine, I will set the table. I turned off the lights. For the first time in 6 months, I was going to sleep soundly. I knew exactly who I was now. I was the demolition crew, and on Thursday, I wasn't just bringing a pie. I was bringing the truth. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by the debris of my former life. The single sheet of paper from the laboratory lay on the carpet like a landmine I had just stepped on. But the explosion was silent. 0%. The number was absolute. It was a mathematical certainty that erased 33 years of wondering why I had never been good enough. I picked up the letter from my grandmother again. My hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, clarifying adrenaline. I needed to know the rest. I needed to know how she had done it, and more importantly, I needed to know why she had left me in the dark for so long. Lillian's handwriting was shaky, the penmanship of a woman fighting tremors to get the truth down on paper. I did not come to this conclusion lightly. Sadie, the letter read, I am a woman of science and facts, not gossip. For years, I watched Douglas look at you. I watched him search your face for a reflection of himself and find nothing. I watched him pull away, not out of malice, but out of an instinctual lack of recognition. And I watched your mother. I could hear her voice in my head, dry and authoritative. Patricia has always been a manager of perceptions. She continued, She treats this family like a corporation that must avoid bad press at all costs. But 3 years ago, at Christmas, I saw something that broke my silence. I saw Douglas looking at old photos of his brother, Wesley. He looked at the photo, then he looked at you across the room. I saw the question form in his eyes, and then I saw Patricia distract him, pull him away, change the subject. She saw it too. She was terrified he would connect the dots. I remembered that Christmas. I remembered feeling like a specimen under a microscope. I decided then that I needed insurance. Lillian wrote, I needed to know if my suspicions were valid before I could protect you. I became a thief in my own home. Do you remember the Sunday dinner when Douglas cut his hand carving the roast? I offered to clean up the bandages. I didn't throw them away. I kept a sample. And you? Do you remember when you stayed over to help me reorganize the attic? You brushed your hair in the guest bath. I took the hair from your brush. I sent them to a private lab in Maryland, paying in cash so there would be no paper trail leading back to the Livingston accounts. I stared at the paper. My grandmother, the pillar of propriety, had been running a covert operation right under my mother's nose. She had stolen blood and hair because she knew that in this family. Truth was a contraband item. When the results came back, I confronted your mother. The letter went on. I leaned in closer, hungry for this part of the story. I tried to imagine Patricia Livingston, the woman who never had a hair out of place, being cornered. I expected her to deny it. Lillian wrote, I expected her to scream, but she didn't. She collapsed. She sat at my kitchen table and wept. Not for you, Sadie. She wept for herself. She told me that if the truth came out, Douglas would leave her. She said the scandal would destroy her standing in the community. She said it would ruin Madeline's chances of a good marriage if the family name was tainted by illegitimacy. My stomach twisted. Even in her moment of exposure, my mother's primary concern had been Madeline's marriageability and her own social calendar. She begged me to take the secret to my grave. Lillian continued. She said that if I told Douglas, she would make sure you never saw the inside of that house again. She threatened to cut you off completely, and I was afraid for you. Sadie, you were so desperate for their love. I knew that if I detonated this bomb while I was alive, Patricia would spin the narrative. She would paint you as the villain. She would isolate you before you had a chance to stand on your own 2 feet. I understood now. The silence hadn't been an act of cowardice. It had been a strategic delay. So I made a deal with the devil. The letter read, I agreed to stay silent on one condition, that she treat you better, but she broke that promise the moment my health began to fail. I saw how she relegated you to the back of the room at the hospital. I saw how she prepared to erase you. That is why I created the 6-month window. I knew that after I died, the grief would make you vulnerable. If you learned the truth immediately, you might have begged them for forgiveness for a sin you didn't commit. I needed you to spend 6 months in the cold. I needed you to feel the full weight of their indifference, so that when you finally opened this envelope, you wouldn't be looking for a father. You would be looking for justice. She was right. If I had known this 6 months ago, at the funeral, I might have tried to use it as leverage to get them to love me. I might have thought, if I tell them I know, maybe they will finally be honest. But 6 months of silence, of being treated like a servant, had burned that softness out of me. But there was one more page in the envelope, a document I hadn't looked at closely yet. It was titled, Codicil to the Livingston Family Trust. I knew about the trust. It was the financial engine that kept the family lifestyle afloat. The vintage cars, the vacations, the maintenance on the big house. It was controlled by my mother. With Madeline as the primary beneficiary, I had always been told that my share was managed for my own good, which was code for you get nothing unless we feel generous. But this document was different. It was signed by Lillian and notarized by Gavin Holt. Clause 4B, the truth contingency. I read the legal jargon, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the event that the biological parentage of Sadie Livingston is publicly acknowledged or legally verified, the assets previously held in the Lillian Visa Moore Discretionary Fund including the deed to the property at 42 Oak Lane, the family home, and the entirety of the liquid assets therein, shall bypass the primary beneficiary, Patricia Livingston, and transfer immediately and irrevocably to Sadie Livingston. I gasped. Lillian hadn't just left me a letter. She had left me the house my parents lived in, the house where I was currently banned from sitting at the dining table. The house was technically held in Lillian's trust, and she had rigged the deed, as long as the secret was kept. Patricia controlled the house, but the moment the truth came out, the moment the lie was exposed, the house belonged to me. I sat back, the magnitude of her strategy washing over me. This was why Gavin had called it a weapon. It wasn't just emotional leverage. It was a nuclear launch key. My mother knew this. She had to know. That was why she was so terrified of me. That was why she kept me at arm's length but never fully cut me off. She needed to keep me close enough to control, but far enough away to keep anyone from asking questions. And the no seat for disappointments rule? It wasn't just cruelty. It was a quarantine measure. I stood up and began to pace my small bedroom. Every time I had been excluded from a family photo, it wasn't because I was ugly. It was because I didn't look like Douglas. Every time my mother spoke over me at parties, it wasn't because I was boring. It was because she was terrified I would say something that didn't align with the timeline of her marriage. Every time I was sent to the kitchen during important conversations, it was to keep the evidence out of sight. They hadn't been bullying me. They had been managing a risk. I was a walking liability to their empire of lies. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. I could not go into that dinner shouting. If I walked in there and just screamed that Douglas wasn't my father, my mother would call me a liar. She would say I was hysterical. She would say I was mentally unstable, something she had hinted at for years. She would gasp and cry and tell everyone that poor Sadie had finally cracked. I needed to be smarter. I needed to be undeniable. I gathered the papers, the letter, the DNA report, the birth certificate, and the trust codicil. I grabbed my keys and drove to the 24-hour copy shop 3 towns over. I didn't want to use the scanner at work. I didn't want any digital footprint on a company server, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the shop. I made 5 copies of everything. The hum of the machine was the only sound in the empty store. Zip-zap, zip-zap. I watched the words, probability of paternity, 0% slide out of the tray over and over again. I bought a box of heavy linen envelopes from the stationery aisle. I bought a red marker. I went back to my car and sat in the parking lot. Assembling my ammunition, I placed 1 full set of copies into a pristine white envelope. I sealed it. I didn't write a name on it. It didn't need a name. I took the originals, the ones with the real wax seal and the wet ink signatures, and drove to my bank. I used the night drop box to deposit them into my safety deposit box. I wasn't taking the originals into that house. If my mother got her hands on them, she would burn them in the centerpiece candle before the turkey was even carved. I drove home. It was 3 a.m. when I finally walked back into my apartment. I was exhausted, but my mind was razor sharp. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner. I thought about the table with 23 chairs. I thought about Madeline's big announcement and the way my mother had ordered me to come early to set the stage. Okay, I whispered to the darkness. I wasn't going to refuse to set the table. I was going to set it exactly the way they wanted. I was going to place the forks and the knives. I was going to polish the silver until it gleamed. I was going to make sure every napkin was folded into a perfect swan. I would play the role of the servant one last time. I would let them get comfortable. I would let them start their speeches. I would let them think they had won, that they had successfully erased me from the narrative. And then, when the moment was perfect, when the silence was absolute, I would force them to look at the one thing they had spent 3 decades trying to hide. I looked at the envelope sitting on my counter. They said there was no seat for disappointments. That was fine. I didn't want a seat for a disappointment. I wanted a seat for the owner of the house. I went to my closet and pulled out my outfit for Thursday. My mother had told me to wear something appropriate. She had told me not to look like I was going to a funeral. I pulled out a dress I had bought years ago and never worn. It was a deep, blood red. It was vibrant. It was alive. It was a dress that said, "I am here." I wasn't going to a funeral. I was going to an eviction. I turned off the light and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise on the day that would end the Livingston family as we knew it. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a sky the color of polished steel, bright and hard. I pulled my car into the driveway of my parents' house at 10 o'clock sharp. The house looked like it had been ripped straight from the pages of a lifestyle magazine. Corn stalks were tied to the porch pillars with orange ribbons that were perfectly symmetrical. White pumpkins lined the steps, ascending in size order. A wreath made of dried wheat and pheasant feathers hung on the front door. It was a display of aggressive hospitality. It screamed family values to anyone driving past, masking the Cold War happening inside. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was wearing the red dress. It was a deep, crimson shade, not bright like a fire engine, but dark like arterial blood. It fitted me perfectly, hugging my waist and flaring slightly at the hips. I had spent 33 years trying to blend into the beige wallpaper of the Livingston estate. Today, I was wearing a color that demanded to be seen. I grabbed the pecan pie from the passenger seat. I checked my bag to make sure the envelope, the copy, not the original, was sitting securely in the side pocket. I walked up the steps and opened the door without knocking. The heat of the house hit me first, smelling of sage, roasting poultry, and cinnamon. Then came the noise, the low hum of the television from the den, the clatter of pans from the kitchen, the high-pitched laughter of my Aunt Renee coming from the living room. I walked into the dining room. It was a masterpiece of exclusion. The table had been extended with all three of its leaves, stretching almost the entire length of the room. A crisp white tablecloth draped over it, ironed to perfection. Down the center ran a runner of burlap and lace, topped with mercury glass votives and arrangements of hydrangeas and eucalyptus. There were chairs everywhere. I stood at the head of the table and began to count. 1, 2, 3. I walked slowly around the perimeter, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood. 4, 5, 6. Each setting was an island of wealth. Gold-rimmed chargers, crystal goblets, heavy silverware that felt like weapons in your hand, and at the top of each plate sat a name card. My mother's handwriting was elegant, full of sweeping loops and sharp ascenders. Uncle Mark, Cousin Sarah, Aunt Renee, Douglas, Patricia, Madeline, Greg. I kept walking. I kept reading. I saw names of second cousins who lived 3 states away. I saw the name of the local pastor, who had apparently been invited to bless the food. I saw the name of Madeline's husband's business partner. I reached the end of the table. 23 chairs. I circled back. I checked the sideboard. I checked the small kids' table set up in the corner. There was no card for Sadie. I stood there, the pie box growing heavy in my arms. I wasn't surprised. In fact, a dark, cold satisfaction settled in my chest. If there had been a seat, a bad seat, a folding chair in the corner, a spot near the kitchen door, I might have faltered. I might have thought, maybe they are trying. Maybe I am overreacting. But this was total erasure. This was a declaration of war written in calligraphy. "Oh, you're here." I turned. My mother was standing in the archway leading to the kitchen. She was wearing an apron over a cashmere sweater set, holding a stack of linen napkins. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the pie, then at my dress. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the color. "Hello, Mother," I said. My voice was steady. "I was just looking for my seat." She walked past me to the table, adjusting a fork that was a millimeter out of alignment. "We are tight on space this year," she said, her tone breezy and dismissive. Madeline invited a few extra people from Greg's firm, and the pastor accepted last minute. We ran out of room at the main table. "There are 23 seats," I said. "You have a table that seats 24 if you use the other leaf." "The other leaf is broken," she lied. She didn't even blink. "Besides, 24 is too crowded. You can eat in the kitchen. It will be quieter for you. You can help manage the serving flow." "Manage the serving flow?" I repeated. So I am the staff. Don't be dramatic, Sadie, she snapped, finally looking at me. Someone has to make sure the gravy stays hot. You are good at that sort of thing. You are practical. She turned her back on me and started counting the wine glasses. I have been coming to this house for 33 years, I said to her back. I am your daughter, and you are telling me that on Thanksgiving, there is no place for me at the family table because you invited your son-in-law's business partner? Patricia spun around. Her face was hard, the mask of the perfect hostess slipping just enough to reveal the steel underneath. You are being selfish, she hissed. This is Madeline's year. She is pregnant. She is happy. I will not have you sitting there with your sour face, bringing down the mood. You make people uncomfortable. Sadie, you always have. Why? I asked. Why do I make them uncomfortable? Because you just do, she said, waving a hand as if shooing away a fly. Now take that pie into the kitchen, and don't let the crust get soggy. I didn't move. I count 23 chairs. Mom, that is an odd number. Who is sitting in the 23rd chair? Before she could answer, a voice floated in from the living room. Oh, Sadie, you made it. Madeline appeared. She looked like a fertility goddess. She was wearing a cream-colored maternity dress that flowed around her hair falling in soft, expensive waves. She waddled slightly, a performative waddle, considering she was only 5 months along, and came over to inspect the table. She beamed at the setting. It looks magical. Mom, then she looked at me. Love the dress, Sadie, bold choice, very loud. Where am I sitting, Madeline? I asked. Madeline let out a tinkling laugh, placing a hand on her stomach. Oh, don't be silly. Mom explained it, didn't she? We are squeezed tight. She walked over to the chair next to where she would be sitting. There was a name card there. It didn't have a name. It had a drawing of a rattle. That, Madeline said, pointing to the empty chair, is for the baby. I stared at her. The baby is inside you, Madeline. It doesn't need a chair. It represents the future, Madeline said, her voice taking on a saccharine, lecturing tone. We want to manifest space for the new life coming into the family. It is symbolic. Greg and I thought it would be sweet to have a place set for the little one, so we can feel their spirit with us. I looked from Madeline to the empty chair, then to my mother. You are giving a chair to a fetus, I said slowly, and sending your sister to the kitchen. It is not just a fetus, Madeline said, her eyes flashing. It is the first grandchild. It is the heir. It is important. And I am not? Oh my God, Madeline groaned, looking at our mother. She is doing it again. She is making everything about her. Mom, I told you she would ruin the vibe. Go to the kitchen, Sadie, Patricia ordered. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. Now, I looked at them. The two of them, standing there in their matching blonde privilege, united in their delusion. They thought they were winning. They thought they were putting me in my place. Fine, I said. I turned and walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was hot and chaotic. The catering staff, 2 women I didn't recognize, were busy plating appetizers. They glanced at me, confused by the woman in the red dress standing by the commercial refrigerator. I set the pie down on the granite island. I needed air. I needed to see if there was anyone in this house who possessed a spine. I walked out the back door onto the patio. The cold air bit at my bare arms, but it felt good. It felt real. My father was standing by the railing, overlooking the expansive backyard. He was holding a tumbler of scotch. It was barely noon. Hello, Dad, I said. Douglas didn't turn around. He was staring at the line of trees at the edge of the property, his shoulders hunched in his expensive tweed jacket. Sadie, he said. His voice was thick. Mom kicked me off the table, I said. I am eating in the kitchen. Did you know? He took a sip of his drink. The ice clinked. Your mother wants everything perfect for Madeline. And me eating in the kitchen makes it perfect? He turned then. He looked tired. His eyes were red-rimmed, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something that looked like guilt, but it was weak. It was the guilt of a man who watches a drowning and does nothing because he doesn't want to get his suit wet. You have always been difficult for her, Douglas said. You remind her of things she wants to move past. What things? I asked. I stepped closer. What do I remind her of? Dad? Why am I the only one who doesn't fit? Douglas looked at me. He looked at my eyes, my forehead, my chin. He was doing it again, searching for himself and failing to find it. You are your mother's daughter, he said. He emphasized the word mother. It wasn't a compliment. It was an abdication. He was washing his hands of me. He was saying, you are her problem. You come from her side. You are nothing to me. Is that all I am? I asked. It is complicated. Sadie, he said, turning back to the trees. Just try to keep the peace today. For everyone's sake. Peace, I repeated. Sure. I left him with his scotch and his cowardice. I walked around the side of the house, heading toward the front porch. I needed to get my bag from the hallway before the dinner started. I needed the envelope. As I rounded the corner, a hand reached out from the shadows of the trellis and grabbed my arm. I jumped, spinning around. It was Aunt Renee. My mother's younger sister was the black sheep who had managed to stay in the flock by playing the role of the eccentric, harmless spinster. She was smoking a cigarette, hiding the glowing cherry behind her back like a teenager. Jesus, Aunt Renee, I breathed. Shh, she hissed. She pulled me into the blind spot behind the large rhododendron bush. She will kill me if she sees me smoking. She says it smells up the upholstery. Renee looked at me. She was wearing a velvet blazer that had seen better days, and her eyeliner was a little too heavy, but her eyes were sharp. They were the only eyes in this family that looked at me with actual recognition. I saw the table, Renee said quietly. It is a pile of crap. Sadie, total crap. It is fine, I said, my voice hard. I am used to it. No, you are not, Renee said. And you shouldn't be. I heard what you said to them. She took a drag of her cigarette, blowing the smoke up into the gray sky. Lillian told me, you know, she said. I froze. Told you what? About the test, Renee said. She looked at me directly. I was the one who got the water glass. Lillian couldn't reach it without looking suspicious. I swiped Douglas's glass from the sink while Patricia was arguing with the gardener. I stared at her. My eccentric, flighty Aunt Renee had been the accomplice. You knew? I whispered. You knew for 2 years and you didn't tell me? I couldn't, Renee said, her voice trembling slightly. Lillian made me swear. She said it had to be done right. She said if we moved too fast, Patricia would destroy the evidence. You know how your mother is. She burns things she doesn't like. Renee reached out and touched my arm. Her fingers were cold. But you know now, don't you? Renee asked. I can see it in your face. You have that look Lillian used to get when she was about to checkmate someone. I know, I said. I know Douglas isn't my father. Renee nodded. She took another nervous drag. Listen to me. Sadie, it is not just about Douglas. That is the easy part. What do you mean? Your mother isn't just hiding an affair, Renee whispered, leaning in close, the smell of tobacco and mint gum on her breath. She is hiding a person. She is protecting someone. Who? I asked. Who is she protecting? She has spent 30 years keeping you and Douglas apart emotionally so you wouldn't figure it out, Renee said. But the man, the real one, he isn't some stranger. Sadie, he isn't some random guy she met at a bar. Renee looked toward the house, her eyes wide with fear. He is close, she said. He has always been close, and if you drop this bomb today, you need to be ready for the shrapnel, because it is going to hit people you don't expect. Who is he? Renee? I demanded. I can't say the name, Renee said, backing away. I promised Lillian I wouldn't say the name. You have to find that out yourself. But just be careful. Your mother is cornered. And a cornered rat bites. Let her bite, I said. I have teeth too. Sadie! My mother's voice rang out from the front porch. Sadie, where the hell are you? The guests are arriving. Renee dropped her cigarette and crushed it under her heel. Go. Don't let her see us talking. Just, good luck, kid. She slipped around the back of the house. I smoothed the front of my red dress. I took a deep breath of the cold. Crisp air. I wasn't eating in the kitchen. I walked up the front steps just as the first car of guests pulled in. I smiled. It was a terrifying smile. I went inside and walked straight to the hallway where my bag was waiting. I slipped the white envelope out. I held it against my side. I walked into the dining room. The guests were mingling, holding wine glasses, admiring the decor. My mother was holding court near the fireplace. Madeline was showing off the baby's empty chair to a group of cooing aunts. I walked over to the table. I picked up the name card that had the drawing of the rattle on it. I ripped it in half. I dropped the pieces on the floor. Then I pulled out the chair, the 23rd chair, and sat down. The room was still noisy. No one had noticed yet, but they would. I placed the envelope on the charger plate in front of me. I crossed my legs. I waited. My mother turned. She saw me. Her smile faltered. She started walking toward me, her eyes wide with fury. Sadie, she hissed as she got close. What do you think you are doing? I told you. I found a seat, I said, my voice loud enough to cut through the chatter nearby. That is for the baby, she whispered, grabbing my shoulder. Get up. Now. The baby isn't here, I said, looking her dead in the eye. But I am, and we have a lot to talk about. I shrugged her hand off my shoulder. Sit down, Mother, I said. It is time for grace. The room went quiet, not because of me, but because the host, Douglas, had just tapped his spoon against his glass. Everyone, Douglas announced, his voice booming hollowly. Please, take your seats. My mother looked at me. She looked at the guests watching us. She was trapped by her own rules of etiquette. She couldn't drag me out screaming without making a scene. She swallowed her rage, a visible lump moving down her throat. Fine, she mouthed, but you will pay for this. She turned and walked to her seat at the other end of the table. I smiled. The check was in the mail, and I was about to cash it. My defiance in taking the 23rd chair lasted exactly 4 minutes. It was a short-lived victory, a small flag planted on a beach that was about to be hit by a tsunami. As soon as I sat down, the air in the room thickened. My mother, Patricia, did not drag me out by my hair. She did something far more effective. She simply signaled the catering staff to skip me. The servers moved around the table with bottles of expensive Cabernet. They poured for Douglas. They poured for Madeline. They poured for the cousin who had been arrested for DUI last year. But when the server reached me, my mother caught her eye and gave a microscopic shake of her head. The bottle lifted, skipped over my glass, and moved to the next person. I sat there with my empty crystal goblet, a red island in a sea of inclusion. I wasn't fighting for the wine. I was noting the data points. Everyone, Douglas said. Standing up, he tapped his knife against his glass again. The room fell silent. My father looked the part of the patriarch perfectly. He was handsome in that weathered, country club way, his silver hair catching the light of the chandelier. He placed a hand on Patricia's shoulder. I want to thank my beautiful wife, Douglas began, his voice warm and rich, the voice of a man who believed his own press release. Patricia, you have outdone yourself. This home is a sanctuary because of you. There was a murmur of agreement. Here, here. And to Madeline, Douglas continued. Turning his gaze to my sister, his eyes softened. It was a look of genuine, uncomplicated adoration. My shining star, seeing you become a mother is the greatest joy of my life. You are going to be wonderful, he raised his glass higher. And to the little one, he said, nodding at the empty chair with the rattle drawing that I had discarded on the floor, which someone had helpfully picked up and placed back on the table. pointedly ignoring me. To the future of the Livingston name, we cannot wait to meet you. To the future, the guests chorused. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap. I waited. I waited for the and to Sadie, and to my eldest, and to the daughter who drove me to the emergency room when I had kidney stones. But the and never came. Douglas took a sip of his wine and sat down. The toast was over. The roll call was complete. I had been edited out of the script in real time. Madeline stood up next. She smoothed her dress over her bump, waiting for the applause to die down. She loved an audience. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I just want to say how lucky I am. To be surrounded by this much love, it is overwhelming." She scanned the table, making eye contact with everyone. Her gaze landed on me for a fraction of a second. "And I want to thank Sadie," she said. The room turned to look at me. I stiffened. Was this an olive branch? "Sadie," Madeline continued, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "you are such a rock, you know? You are the foundation, always there in the background, holding things up, doing the heavy lifting so the rest of us can fly. We don't say it enough, but reliable people are so important." I felt the compliment land like a boot on my neck. Foundation. That was what you called the concrete you poured into the dirt so you could build something beautiful on top of it. You walked on the foundation. You buried the foundation. You didn't invite the foundation to dinner. "To Sadie," a cousin mumbled, raising a glass half-heartedly. "Now," Madeline said, clapping her hands. "Mom, the caterers are taking too long with the soup. Sadie, would you mind checking on them? And maybe bring out the bread baskets? You know where we keep the good butter." It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. "You have been acknowledged. Now go back to your station." I looked at my mother. She was watching me with a smug, challenge-filled expression. "Go on," her eyes said. "Make a scene. Prove you are the unstable one." I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Of course," I said. "I would love to help." I walked into the kitchen. The swing door closed behind me, muting the chatter of the dining room. The kitchen was a flurry of activity. The caterers were plating the soup. I ignored them. I walked over to the counter where I had left the pecan pie. It sat there in its humble cardboard box, smelling of roasted nuts and caramelized sugar. It was the only thing in this house that was real. It was the only thing that contained a drop of love. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the box. Through the thin gap between the door and the frame, the voices from the dining room drifted in. They thought I was gone. They thought the airlock was sealed. "She wore red," I heard my mother say. Her voice was low, but it carried. "Can you believe it? To Thanksgiving, she looks like a harlot. She is just desperate for attention." "Pat," an aunt said, "it is sad. Really, 33 years old, and still acting out like a teenager." "She has always been difficult," Douglas's voice joined in. It hurt more than the others because it was resigned. "Even when she was little, she just never fit in. She is hard edges. Madeline is soft." "Well, at least she is useful," Madeline laughed. "I mean, someone has to check the soup, right? She has a career in service. After all, it suits her." Laughter. Light, polite, cruel laughter. I stood in the kitchen, and I felt the last tether snap. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot. Anger is messy. This was clarity. It was the cold, hard clarity of a diamond cutter finding the exact point of weakness in a stone. I picked up the pie. I picked up the white envelope from my bag, which I had brought into the kitchen with me. I slid the envelope under the pie box. Holding them together with one hand, I kicked the kitchen door open. I didn't walk in quietly this time. I walked in with purpose. My heels struck the floor with a military rhythm. The conversation died down as I approached the table. They expected bread baskets. They expected butter. Instead, I marched straight to the center of the room, right behind Douglas's chair. I set the pie down on the table, right next to the floral centerpiece. The cardboard box looked violent against the pristine white tablecloth and the crystal. "We don't need that," my mother said instantly. She stood up, her face flushing with irritation. "Sadie, remove that. We have a pear tart from the caterer. That thing ruins the aesthetic." "It is Grandma Lillian's recipe," I said. My voice was calm, but it filled the room. "She made this every year. It belongs on this table." "It looks cheap," Madeline sneered, wrinkling her nose. "Take it away. Sadie, you are embarrassing yourself." "Take it to the kitchen. Sadie," my mother commanded. She pointed a manicured finger at the door. "Now, I will not ask you again." I looked at the pie. Then I looked at the 23 faces staring at me. They looked at me with annoyance, with pity, with disdain. They looked at me like I was a stain on their perfect picture. "If the pie has no seat," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed off the walls, "then I understand why I don't either." "Oh, for God's sake," my mother snapped. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. "Stop playing the victim. You don't have a seat because you didn't earn one. You bring nothing but misery to this family. There is no seat for disappointments. Sadie, get out." The words hung in the air. No seat for disappointments. She had said it. She had said the line that had been the subtext of my entire life. I smiled. "You are right, Mother," I said. "There is no seat for disappointments, and there is no seat for lies." I reached under the pie box. I pulled out the envelope. It was white, stark, and terrifying. I didn't hand it to my mother. I didn't hand it to Madeline. I leaned over my father's shoulder. I could smell his cologne, sandalwood and expensive scotch. I placed the envelope gently, precisely, squarely in the center of his dinner plate. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dad," I said. Douglas looked down at the envelope. He looked up at me, confused. "What is this?" "It is the reason I don't fit," I said. "It is the reason I have hard edges." I straightened up and addressed the entire table. "I am not a disappointment," I said clearly. "I am a secret." I turned back to Douglas. "I am not your biological daughter. Douglas, Grandma Lillian left the proof." The silence that followed was not the silence of a pause. It was the silence of a vacuum. It was the sound of oxygen leaving the room. "What?" Douglas whispered. The word fell out of his mouth like a stone. Sadie didn't open it. She didn't even hand it around like a show-and-tell prop. She just let it sit there, white, clean, and poisonous, right on Douglas's plate. "I don't need to read it out loud," I said, my voice calm enough to scare even me. "I just need you to know it exists." Douglas stared at the envelope like it had teeth. My mother made a strangled noise and lunged across the table, fingers clawing for it. "Don't you touch that!" she shrieked. "Douglas, don't! She's lying. She's sick." But her panic was the point. I leaned in just slightly, close enough for only them to hear. "Enjoy your meal," I added, soft as a blessing. "We'll talk after." No one moved. No one breathed. And for the first time in my life, the entire table revolved around me, without my permission, without my apology. His face went gray. It wasn't a figure of speech. The color literally drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a wax statue. "Patricia?" he said. His voice was unrecognizable. It was the voice of a child waking up in a nightmare. My mother froze. She was standing halfway out of her chair, her hand extended, caught in a tableau of guilt. She didn't look at Douglas. She looked at the papers, her eyes wide with terror. "It is a forgery," she stammered. "Sadie made it up. You know she hates us. She printed it off the internet." "It is not a forgery," a voice said from the side of the table. We all turned. Aunt Renee was standing up. Her hands were shaking, clutching her napkin, but her chin was high. "It is real, Patricia," Renee said. "Lillian ordered the test. I helped her collect the samples. I saw the original results 6 months ago." You traitor," my mother hissed, turning on her sister. You helped her ruin this family? You ruined it 33 years ago. Pat, Renee said, her voice trembling but firm. Sadie just turned on the lights. Douglas was reading the letter now. He was reading Lillian's words. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves in a windstorm. 33 years, Douglas whispered. He looked up at Patricia. The adoration was gone. The warmth was gone. In their place was a hollow, gaping horror. You let me raise a stranger? You let me treat her like she was broken? When it was you? I did it for us, Patricia screamed. The mask was gone completely now. Her face was twisted, ugly, desperate. I did it to save us. Douglas, we had a reputation. We had a life. I couldn't let one mistake destroy everything. One mistake? I said. I looked at my mother. I was looking for remorse. I was looking for a mother who was sorry she had hurt her child. But I didn't see it. I saw fear. She wasn't looking at me with apology. She was looking at the guests. She was looking at the business partners, the pastor, the cousins. She was watching her social standing evaporate in real time. She was watching her kingdom burn, and she was only worried about the smoke damage to the curtains. You aren't sorry you lied, I said, realizing it out loud. You are just sorry you got caught. Get out! My mother screamed at me. She grabbed a wine glass and hurled it. It missed me by a foot, shattering against the wall behind me, spraying red wine like blood across the expensive wallpaper. Get out of my house! It is not your house, I said. I looked at the guests. They were frozen in their chairs, their mouths open, their forks hovering. This was better than any play they had ever seen. Enjoy the turkey, I said. I hear the stuffing is excellent this year. It is full of secrets. I turned to my father. He was slumped in his chair, staring at the DNA report, as if trying to rearrange the numbers with his mind. He looked old. He looked broken. I won't be staying for dessert, I said. I walked toward the door. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I passed Madeline. She was clutching her stomach, her face pale. She looked at me, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look at me with superiority. She looked at me with fear. She realized that the foundation she had been standing on had just walked away, and the floor was starting to crack. I walked out of the dining room. I walked down the hall. I grabbed my coat. Behind me, the sound of chaos erupted. Shouting, crying, the sound of a marriage ending, the sound of a dynasty collapsing. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cold, gray afternoon. I took a deep breath. The air tasted like winter. It tasted like ice. But for the first time in 33 years, it tasted like freedom. The fallout from Thanksgiving did not happen all at once. It happened in waves, like the aftershocks of an earthquake that had finally leveled a city built on a fault line. For the first 48 hours, I stayed in my apartment with the blinds drawn and my phone on silent. But silence does not stop the signal. I could see the notifications lighting up my screen like fireworks. The Livingston family, a sprawling network of aunts, uncles, and second cousins, had fractured into 3 distinct camps. Camp 1 was the apologizers. These were the distant relatives, the cousins who had always been nice but passive. They sent texts that started with phrases like, "I had no idea," or "I'm so sorry for what you went through." They were trying to distance themselves from the wreckage, checking to make sure they weren't on my hit list. Camp 2 was the silencers. This group, led by the older generation, simply pretended it hadn't happened. They didn't text. They didn't call. They just unfriended me on Facebook or blocked my number, terrified that acknowledging the explosion would somehow make them complicit in the debris. And then there was Camp 3, the blamers. This camp was loudest, and its captain was my mother, Patricia. According to the voicemails my Aunt Renee forwarded me, because my mother refused to speak to me directly, Patricia had already constructed a fortress of denial. She was telling anyone who would listen that I had suffered a nervous breakdown. She claimed I had forged the documents on a home computer. She said I was jealous of Madeline's pregnancy and had staged a cruel, psychotic prank to steal the spotlight. It was a good story. If I didn't have the original documents locked in a safety deposit box, it might have even worked. But the person who called me the most wasn't my mother. It was Madeline. My sister called me 14 times in 2 days. I finally answered on Saturday morning, mostly because I wanted the buzzing to stop. "How could you?" she screamed the moment I picked up. There was no hello. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You ruined my announcement. I had a photographer coming. Sadie. A professional photographer." I sat on my kitchen counter, drinking black coffee. "I think the paternity of your sister is slightly more important than your Instagram engagement metrics." Madeline. "It is not about Instagram," she shrieked, though I knew it was. "It is about my baby. I wanted this to be a happy memory. Now, every time I think about my pregnancy, I'm going to think about you throwing a pie and screaming at Dad. You are so selfish. You always have to make everything about you." "I didn't throw the pie," I said calmly. "I placed it on the table, and I think you are missing the point. Dad isn't my dad. Mom lied to all of us. Doesn't that bother you?" "I don't care," Madeline sobbed, and for the first time, I heard the fear underneath the narcissism. "I don't care who your dad is. I just want my family back. Douglas moved out. Sadie." He packed a bag and went to the athletic club. "Mom is locked in her room drinking wine and screaming at the walls. You broke us." "I didn't break us, Madeline," I said, feeling a cold, hard knot in my chest. "I just turned on the lights. The cracks were already there." "I hate you," she whispered, sounding like a child. "I hope it was worth it." She hung up. I stared at the phone. It hurt, but it was a dull ache, like pressing on an old bruise. I had expected this. Madeline was a creature of comfort. I had threatened her habitat. So naturally, she was baring her teeth. I needed to get out of the apartment. I texted Aunt Renee. "Coffee?" Her reply came 3 seconds later. "The diner on 5th, 20 minutes. Wear sunglasses." I arrived at the diner wearing a baseball cap and dark glasses, feeling ridiculous. But when I walked in, I saw Renee huddled in a back booth, looking over her shoulder like a spy in a Cold War novel. She looked tired. Her eyeliner was smudged, and she was chain-smoking, despite the no smoking sign that the waitress was pointedly ignoring. "You look like hell," I said, sliding into the booth opposite her. "And you look like the Grim Reaper," Renee shot back, pushing a cup of black coffee toward me. "It is a war zone over there. Sadie, a complete and total meltdown." "Madeline told me Douglas moved out," I said. "He did," Renee nodded. "He went straight to his lawyer's office on Friday morning, filed for legal separation. The divorce papers will follow by Monday. I guarantee it. He is done. Sadie, I have never seen him like this. He is not yelling. He is just icy. He looks at your mother like she is a stranger he met at a bus stop." "And Mom?" I asked. Renee let out a short, harsh laugh. "Patricia? Oh, she is performing the role of a lifetime. She is playing the victim, the martyr, and the saint all at once. She is telling everyone that Douglas is having a midlife crisis and that you are mentally unstable. She is trying to get the pastor to come over and do an intervention for you." "She can try," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "But she knows the DNA test is real." "Of course she knows," Renee said, leaning in. "That is why she is dangerous right now. She has lost control of the narrative. For 30 years, Patricia has controlled everything. What we ate, where we sat, who we married. Now, the script is gone. She is improvising, and she is terrified." Renee crushed her cigarette out in a saucer. "But there is something else," she said, lowering her voice. "Douglas isn't just angry about the lie. He is spooked. I saw him going through old boxes in the attic before he left. He wasn't looking for financial records. He was looking for photos." "Photos of what?" "I don't know," Renee said. "But he took a file with him, and he asked me a question before he walked out the door. He asked me, 'Did you know who it was?' And did you?" I asked. Renee shook her head vigorously. "No, Lillian never told me the name. She just told me Douglas wasn't the father, but Douglas, I think he has a suspect. Who? He wouldn't say, Renee said. But he told me to tell you he would find you. He said he needed to talk to you on neutral ground. Neutral ground turned out to be my workplace. 3 days later, on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk at Hawthorne and Vale Community Services, trying to help a young mother navigate a SNAP application. The office was chaotic as usual. Phones ringing, babies crying, the smell of damp coats and cheap coffee filling the air. Sadie? My supervisor. Brenda called out from the front desk. There is a man here to see you. He says he is your father. The room went quiet. Or maybe it just went quiet in my head. I stood up. Send him back. Brenda. Douglas Livingston walked into the cramped, fluorescent-lit office. He was wearing a charcoal wool coat and a scarf, looking incredibly expensive and incredibly out of place. He looked around at the peeling paint, the stacks of files, the frantic energy of poverty management. He looked like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn into a war zone. He saw me. He stopped. He looked older than he had on Thanksgiving. His face was gray, the lines around his mouth etched deep. He wasn't the confident patriarch raising a glass of wine. He was a man whose entire history had been rewritten overnight. Sadie, he said. His voice was rough. Douglas, I said. I couldn't call him Dad. Not here, not now. You can sit, if you want. I pointed to the plastic chair across from my desk. It was orange and cracked. He sat down slowly, unbuttoning his coat. He held a manila envelope in his hands. I have never been here, he said, looking around. You have worked here for 7 years. 8, I corrected. And no, you haven't. It is busy, he said. It is real life, I said. Something we don't do much of in Kestrel Hollow. He winced. He looked down at his hands. I am sorry about the wine. At dinner, I should have stopped her. You should have done a lot of things, I said. But we are past that. Why are you here? Douglas, are you here to tell me the test is wrong? Because I have the original. I know it is real, he said softly. He looked up, and his eyes were wet. I didn't need a test, Sadie. I think I have known for a long time, maybe since you were 10, maybe earlier. Then why? I asked, my voice rising. If you knew, why did you treat me like a mistake? Why didn't you leave her then? Why did you let me think I was just a disappointment? Because I was a coward, he said. The admission hung in the air between us. I was a coward, and I was proud. The Livingston name. It meant everything to me. My father built it. I maintained it. The idea of a scandal, of admitting that my wife had stepped out on me, I couldn't stomach it, so I pretended. I told myself you were just different. I told myself it didn't matter. It mattered to me, I said. It mattered every time you looked at me like I was a stranger. I know, he whispered, and I will regret that until the day I die. I punished you for her sin. It was easier to ignore you than to confront her. He took a deep breath and placed the envelope on my desk. But there was another reason I stayed silent, he said. Another reason I didn't want to pull that thread. What reason? I was afraid of who the father was, Douglas said. He slid the envelope toward me. I found this in an old shoebox in the attic, he said. It was taken the summer you were conceived, 1991, the annual family retreat at the lake house. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It was a glossy 4x6, the colors slightly faded with age. It showed my mother, Patricia. She was young, beautiful, laughing, wearing a white sundress and holding a glass of wine. She was leaning back against a wooden railing. Standing next to her, his arm draped casually but possessively over her shoulders, was a man. He was tall. He had dark hair, just like mine. He had a sharp jawline, just like mine. He had eyes that were shaped exactly like the eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. But he wasn't a stranger. He looked familiar. He looked like a Livingston. Who is this? I asked, my finger hovering over the man's face. Douglas looked at the photo, and his face twisted with a mixture of hatred and grief. I always suspected, he said, but I told myself it was impossible. I told myself she wouldn't do that. Not with him, not with family. Family? I repeated. The word tasted like bile. Who is he? Douglas? That, Douglas said, pointing to the man who looked like my male clone, is not an outsider. Sadie, that is why your mother is so terrified. That is why she tried to bury you. He looked me in the eye. Because if you are his daughter, then you aren't just illegitimate. You are evidence of a betrayal that goes deeper than just marriage. Is he your brother? I asked. The question came out as a whisper. Douglas didn't answer directly. He just stood up. He buttoned his coat with shaking hands. I am going to hire a lawyer to dissolve the trust, he said. But you need to hire someone else. You need to hire a professional. Don't ask your mother. She will never tell you the truth. She will take this to the grave. Who is he? I asked again. Louder this time. His name, Douglas said, his hand on the doorknob, was the only thing we never spoke about. But if you look at that photo, Sadie, you will see it. He has the Livingston chin. He has my father's eyes. He opened the door. I am sorry I didn't protect you, he said. I can't be your father. Biology took that away. But I can be your ally. Find out who he is. And when you do, burn it all down. He walked out. I sat alone in the office. I looked at the photo. The man in the picture was handsome. He had a reckless smile, the kind of smile that breaks hearts and ruins lives. He looked like Douglas, but sharper, more dangerous. I realized then why Aunt Renee had been so scared. I realized why my mother had fought so hard to keep me off the table. This wasn't just adultery. This was incestuous, messy, catastrophic family warfare. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Madeline. I didn't call Renee. I opened my browser and typed in a search query I had been saving for days. Genealogist, private investigation, DNA tracing. I found a number for a woman named Lena Ashford. Her website said she specialized in sensitive family discoveries. I dialed the number. Ashford Investigations, a voice answered. My name is Sadie Livingston, I said, my voice steady. I have a DNA test that says 0%. I have a photograph from 1991, and I need to know the name of the man who gave me this face. I can help with that, the woman said. Do you have a suspect? I think so, I said, looking at the man in the photo who looked like a darker version of the man who had just left my office. I think he is a ghost, and I need you to help me hunt him down. I hung up. I put the photo in my bag. The fallout was over. The investigation had begun. The office of Lena Ashford smelled of ozone and expensive coffee. It was located in a converted warehouse in the Navy Yard district of Philadelphia, a place where the old industrial skeletons of the city were being repurposed into sleek, glass-walled hubs of information. Lena herself was nothing like the dusty, tweed-wearing genealogist I had expected. She was sharp, modern, and terrifyingly efficient, with dual monitors that hummed with the secrets of 1,000 families. I sat across from her, watching her scroll through lines of data that looked like the matrix code of my existence. You were right to come to me, Lena said, her eyes never leaving the screen. Commercial DNA kits are fine for finding out if you are 10% Irish, but for what you are looking for, you need a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Did you find him? I asked. My hands were gripping the arms of the chair so hard my knuckles were white. I found a ghost, Lena said. She spun one of the monitors around to face me. It was a family tree, but it was fractured. There were lines connecting names I knew. Douglas, Patricia, Madeline, but there was a red line branching off from my grandfather, creating a parallel limb that had been severed. Your DNA does not match Douglas Livingston, Lena said, tapping the screen. We knew that. But it does match the Livingston male Y chromosome markers. It is a near-perfect match for the paternal line. That means your biological father is not a stranger. Sadie, he is a Livingston. I stared at the screen. How is that possible? Douglas is an only child. That is what I was always told. Douglas is not an only child, Lena said. She clicked a folder, and a scanned image of an old yellowed census record popped up. Douglas had a younger brother, born 3 years after him. His name was Wesley. Wesley. The name hit me like a physical blow. I had never heard it spoken in my house, not once in 33 years. It was a name that had been scrubbed from the family history as thoroughly as I had been scrubbed from the Thanksgiving table. Wesley Livingston, I repeated. Who is he? He was the spare, Lena said, her voice clinical but not unkind. But according to the high school yearbooks and local archives I dug up, he was also the star, quarterback, valedictorian, the one everyone thought would take over the family business. And then, in 1991, the year you were conceived, he vanished. Vanished? No death certificate, Lena said. No marriage license, no property records in Pennsylvania. He just stopped existing. It is like he fell off the edge of the earth. She looked at me, her expression softening. Sadie, the genetic distance between you and this Wesley profile suggests a parent-child relationship. The man in the photo Douglas gave you? That is not just some guy. That is your uncle, and he is your father. I sat back, the air rushing out of my lungs. My uncle, my father. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a violence that made me dizzy. My mother hadn't just cheated on Douglas. She had cheated on him with his own brother. She had slept with the golden boy, the favorite, and then she had stayed with Douglas, the safe choice, the one who would protect her reputation. And me? I was the living, breathing reminder of the brother who got away. No wonder Douglas couldn't look at me. Every time he saw my face, he saw the ghost of the brother who had betrayed him. Where is he now? I asked. That is the tricky part, Lena said. He changed his name, but people leave digital footprints, even when they don't want to. I found a trace of a man named Wes Blackwood living in a cabin in upstate New York. He pays his taxes in cash. He has no social media, but the social security number attached to his limited credit history? It links back to a defunct bank account in Kestrel Hollow from 1990. She handed me a piece of paper with an address. He is alive, Sadie, and I think it is time you introduced yourself. I took the paper, but I wasn't ready to drive to New York yet. I needed to understand the why. Why the total erasure? Why the hatred? I needed Aunt Renee. I drove straight to Renee's condo. It was a small, cluttered place filled with cat towers and books, the exact opposite of my parents' pristine mausoleum. When I told her the name, Renee dropped her mug of tea. It shattered on the linoleum, splashing hot Earl Grey over her slippers, but she didn't even flinch. "Wesley," she whispered. She sank into a kitchen chair, her face pale. "I told Lillian she shouldn't have kept the name from you. I told her." "You knew him?" I asked, grabbing a towel to clean up the mess. "Everyone knew him," Renee said, her voice trembling. "He was electric. Douglas was always the serious one, the responsible one. But Wesley? Wesley was charming. He was wild. And your mother, God, Sadie, your mother was obsessed with him. But she married Douglas," I said. "She married Douglas because Douglas had the trust fund and the stability," Renee said bitterly. "Wesley was volatile. He wanted to travel, to be an artist. Patricia wanted the big house and the country club membership. She chose the lifestyle, not the man, but she couldn't let go of the passion." Renee looked up at me, her eyes full of tears. That summer, the summer of 91, we were all at the lake house. Douglas was in the city working. Wesley was there. Patricia was there. I saw the way they looked at each other. I warned her. I told her she was playing with fire. "And then I happened," I said. "And then you happened." Renee nodded. "And when she found out she was pregnant, she panicked. She knew the timeline didn't match Douglas's visits. She told Wesley, I don't know what she said to him. Sadie, But whatever it was, it broke him. He left the next day. He drove his motorcycle out of the driveway and never came back. We heard rumors he went west. We heard rumors he was dead. Douglas was crushed. He thought his brother just abandoned him. He never knew why. Until now, I said. Until now, Renee agreed. Patricia convinced Douglas that Wesley was unstable, that he was jealous of their happiness. She poisoned the memory of him so Douglas wouldn't go looking for him. She sacrificed his brother to save her marriage. It was a tragedy, a Shakespearean mess of lies and lust, but there was still something missing. My mother was a pragmatist. She was cruel, yes, but she was also calculating. Saving her marriage was a strong motive, but erasing a human being, erasing me, required something more tangible. It required leverage. I left Renee's and went to Gavin Holt's office. The lawyer looked tired when I walked in, but he waved me into his inner sanctum immediately. His desk was covered in files. "I have been digging," Gavin said, skipping the pleasantries. "Since you opened the envelope, I have been going through the archives of the Livingston Legacy Trust. Lillian was a very smart woman. Sadie, she knew Patricia better than anyone." He opened a leather-bound folio. "The house," Gavin said. "The estate at 42 Oak Lane. You think it belongs to your parents, right?" "They have lived there for 30 years, I said. "It is the family home." "It is the family home," Gavin corrected. "But it is not their property. The deed is held in the trust. Your grandfather set it up that way to avoid estate taxes. The trust grants lifetime residency and executive control to the primary beneficiary, which is Patricia," I said. "Which is currently Patricia," Gavin said. He tapped a clause on the third page of the document. "However, Lillian added a codicil 10 years ago. It is the Bloodline Integrity Clause. It states that executive control of the assets, including the right to live in the house and the monthly stipend that supports their lifestyle, is contingent upon the preservation of the direct Livingston lineage within the primary household." I squinted at the legal text. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means," Gavin said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, "that if the head of the household is proven to have brought an illegitimate child into the line of succession and attempted to pass them off as a legitimate heir to the trust, they are in breach of contract." I stared at him. "So if Mom admitted I wasn't Douglas's—" "She would lose the stipend," Gavin said. "But here's the kicker. Sadie, if the child in question is biologically a Livingston, just not from the sanctioned marriage, the trust bypasses the deceiving parent and transfers the executive control to the biological heir, provided they are of age." My jaw dropped. "If I am Wesley's daughter," I said slowly, "I am still a Livingston. I am still a blood heir." "Exactly," Gavin said. "You are a Livingston by blood. Patricia is only a Livingston by marriage. If the truth comes out that she lied about your paternity to defraud the trust, she doesn't just lose her reputation, she loses the house, she loses the money, she loses everything, and the control of the estate? It doesn't go to Douglas, because he is separating from her. It goes to you." The room spun. This was it. This was the root of the rot. Patricia hadn't hated me just because I was a reminder of her infidelity. She hated me because I was a walking eviction notice. Every day, I lived in that house. Every day, I sat at that table. I was a ticking time bomb that could strip her of the only thing she truly loved, her status. She had tried to erase me to secure her real estate portfolio. "She knows," I whispered. "She has to know." "She knows," Gavin confirmed. "Lillian made sure she knew the terms of the trust. That was the threat Lillian held over her head to keep her from disowning you entirely. But now that Lillian is gone, Patricia thought she was safe. She thought she could finally push you out." "She was wrong," I said. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the gray city streets. I felt a strange transformation taking place inside me. The hurt little girl who just wanted a seat at the table was gone. In her place was the owner of the building. "We need to end this," I said, turning back to Gavin. "I don't want a shouting match. I don't want another Thanksgiving drama. I want a legal conclusion. What do you have in mind? Gavin asked. Set up a meeting, I said. Call it a mediation. Tell Patricia and Douglas that we need to discuss the dissolution of the family assets due to the divorce. Tell them it is standard procedure regarding the trust. Make sure Madeline is there too, since she thinks she is the heir apparent. And you? Gavin asked. I will be there, I said, and I'm bringing a guest. Wesley? Gavin asked, his eyebrows raising. Not yet, I said. First, I need to go to New York. I need to look him in the eye. I need to know if he is worth saving, or if he is just another Livingston coward. But for the meeting, I need you to prepare the papers. I want the transfer of deed ready to sign. I picked up my bag. They took my seat, I said to Gavin. So I am going to take their floorboards. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focus. I coordinated with Lena Ashford. I booked a rental car. I printed out the satellite maps of the cabin in upstate New York. But before I left, I received a text from Madeline. Mom is selling the furniture. She says she is redecorating, but I think she is liquidating assets. She is panicking. Sadie, what are you going to do? I didn't reply. I let her sit in the silence. Silence, I had learned, was a powerful weapon. I drove to New York on a Friday. The drive took 6 hours, the landscape shifting from the suburban sprawl of Pennsylvania to the dense, dark woods of the Catskills. I found the cabin at the end of a dirt road that wasn't on the GPS. It was small, rustic, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. It looked lonely. I parked the car and walked up to the porch. My heart was hammering a rhythm against my ribs that felt like a war drum. Thump, thump, thump. I knocked. The door opened. The man standing there was older than the photo. His hair streaked with gray, his face lined by sun and wind. But the eyes were the same. The chin was the same. It was like looking into a mirror that showed me my own face 20 years from now. He looked at me. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask what I wanted. He just gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white, and whispered a single word. Sadie. He knew. He had always known. I didn't hug him. I stood my ground on his porch, the cold wind whipping my hair around my face. My name is Sadie Livingston, I said, and I have a meeting on Monday morning to take back my house. I suggest you get your coat. You have been missing for 33 years. It is time you showed up for something. Wesley looked at me. He looked at the determination in my eyes, the set of my jaw, a jaw I had inherited from him. He stepped back and opened the door wide. Come in, he said. We spent 3 hours talking. I learned about the letters he had sent that Patricia had burned. I learned about the threats she had made, that she would tell the police he had assaulted her if he ever came back. I learned that he hadn't left because he didn't care. He had left because he thought it was the only way to keep me safe from the crossfire. I was wrong, Wesley said, staring into the fire. I should have fought for you. I was young, and I was scared, and I let her win. She hasn't won yet, I said. I pulled the papers out of my bag, the mediation schedule, the DNA results, the trust codicil. Monday, I said. 10 o'clock. Gavin Holt's office. Be there. Wesley looked at the papers. He looked at me. I have nothing, he said. I live in a cabin. I have no money, no status. What can I possibly bring to that table? You don't need money, I said. You just need to be the truth. They have spent 3 decades building a fortress on a lie. You are the wrecking ball. I drove back to Pennsylvania that night. I didn't sleep. Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour. The sky was black, the rain hammering against the pavement like bullets. It was perfect weather for a funeral or an execution. I dressed carefully. I didn't wear red this time. I wore a black suit, sharp and tailored. I pulled my hair back. I looked like a CEO. I looked like the head of the family. I arrived at Gavin's office 10 minutes early. Lena Ashford was already there, sitting in the corner with her laptop, the digital witness to the biological reality. Gavin was at the head of the long mahogany conference table. his legal pads arranged in neat stacks. "Are they coming?" I asked. "They are in the lobby," Gavin said. "Patricia, Douglas, Madeline, and their lawyers." "Good," I said. I sat down at the opposite end of the table. "Send them in." The door opened. My mother walked in first. She looked haggard. Her perfect hair was slightly frizzy from the humidity, and her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal. She was wearing a Chanel suit that looked like armor. Douglas followed. He looked like a ghost. He didn't look at Patricia. He barely looked at me. Madeline brought up the rear, looking terrified and clutching her designer bag as if it contained the last of her dignity. They sat down. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. "Let's get this over with," Patricia snapped. "I don't know why we need a mediation for a simple divorce. The terms of the prenup are clear." "We are not here to discuss the prenup, Patricia," Gavin said calmly. "We are here to discuss the trust." "The trust is mine," Patricia said, her voice rising. "I am the beneficiary. That is not up for debate." "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time, "it is." Patricia glared at me. "You shouldn't even be here. This is family business." "I am family," I said, "and I am the business." I nodded to Gavin. "Patricia," Gavin said, sliding a document across the table. "You are aware of the bloodline integrity clause?" Patricia went pale. That is an archaic rule. It doesn't apply." "It applies if there is a breach of contract regarding the lineage of the heirs," Gavin said. "Sadie has provided irrefutable DNA evidence that she is a biological Livingston, but not through the marriage line. This triggers the transfer of assets." "You can't do this," Patricia screamed, standing up. "I raised her. I fed her. I gave her a roof over her head." "You gave me a roof because the lease required it," I said cold. "And you made me pay rent in humiliation." "This is ridiculous," Patricia spat. "Who is the father then? Sadie? Some random man? That doesn't make you an heir. That makes you a bastard." "The father," a voice said from the doorway, "is a Livingston." The door swung open. Wesley stepped in. He was wearing a suit I had bought him yesterday. He looked distinguished. He looked like the missing piece of the puzzle. The silence in the room was absolute. Douglas made a sound like he had been punched in the gut. He stood up slowly, his chair tipping over backward with a loud crash. "Wes?" Douglas whispered. Patricia stopped breathing. She stared at Wesley as if he were a corpse that had clawed its way out of the grave. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. "Hello, Patty," Wesley said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. "Hello, Doug." "No," Patricia whimpered. She backed away until she hit the wall. "No, you're gone. You're gone." "I was," Wesley said, walking into the room and standing next to my chair. He put a hand on my shoulder. It was heavy and warm. "But my daughter invited me back." I looked at my mother. I saw the exact moment her world shattered. She looked from Wesley to me, and she realized that the two people she had tried to erase had just joined forces. "So," I said, opening the folder in front of me, "about the house," I looked at the empty seat at the head of the table. "I believe," I said, "that is my seat now." The conference room in Gavin Holt's office was silent. But it was not the peaceful silence of a library. It was the suffocating silence of a pressurized cabin seconds before the hull breaches. Outside, the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the Philadelphia skyline into a gray smudge. But inside, the air was crisp, cold, and electric with 33 years of accumulated tension. My mother, Patricia, was pressed against the back wall. She looked small. For my entire life, she had been a giant, a force of nature who controlled the weather in our home with a single raised eyebrow. Now, stripped of her secrets, she looked like a frightened animal cornered by headlights. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the man standing next to my chair. Wesley Livingston. He stood tall, his hands resting on the back of the leather chair I had claimed. His hair was salt and pepper, thick and wavy. A mirror image of the hair Douglas used to have before the stress of living a lie thinned it out. He wore the suit I had bought him, but he wore it with a rugged, careless grace that made Douglas's expensive tailoring look stiff and desperate. "It is not possible," Patricia whispered. Her voice was a dry rattle. "You are gone. You promised you were gone." "I kept my promise, Patty," Wesley said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and it vibrated in the quiet room. "I stayed away. I let you play house. I let you pretend I never existed because I thought that was what was best for everyone. I thought I was the villain of the story." He looked down at me, and his eyes softened. "But you forgot to mention one small detail," he said, turning back to her with a look of pure ice. "You forgot to tell me that when I left. I left a daughter behind." Patricia flinched. "I handled it. I told you I handled it." "Handled it?" Wesley roared. The sudden volume made Madeline jump in her seat. "I thought you meant a clinic. Patricia, I thought you meant you ended the pregnancy. I didn't know you meant you were going to pass my child off as my brother's and treat her like a servant for 3 decades. Douglas made a sound, a low moan of pain. He had his head in his hands, his elbows resting on the mahogany table. He looked up, his eyes red and wet. "Is that true?" Douglas asked Patricia. You told him it was taken care of?" Patricia didn't answer. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving. She looked at the door, calculating the distance, wondering if she could run. But there was nowhere to run. The truth was in the room, and it had locked the door. Gavin Holt cleared his throat. He stood up and adjusted his glasses. "I think we need to look at the facts," Gavin said. He opened the file in front of him. "We have the DNA results from the lab in Maryland, ordered by Lillian Moore before her death. We have the confirmatory test processed by Ashford Investigations this week. The results are conclusive. The probability of paternity between Wesley Livingston and Sadie Livingston is 99.9%. He slid the paper across the table. It stopped right in front of Madeline. My sister looked down at it. She looked at the numbers. She looked at me. "So," Madeline said, her voice trembling. "So she is? She is still my sister? Or my cousin? What is she?" "She is your cousin, Madeline," Gavin said. "Biologically speaking, but legally, in the eyes of the Livingston Legacy Trust, she is a direct descendant of the founder, your grandfather. And that changes everything." Patricia lunged forward then. She slammed her hands on the table, regaining a flash of her old venom. "It changes nothing," she screamed. "The trust is mine. I am the widow. Well, the wife of the heir. I have run that house for 30 years. I decorated it. I maintained it. You can't just take it away because of some biology experiment." "Actually, we can," Gavin said calmly. "Clause 4B, the integrity clause. You knowingly defrauded the trust by concealing an illegitimate heir to secure your position. That is grounds for immediate removal as the primary beneficiary." "I didn't defraud anyone," Patricia shrieked. "I was protecting the family name. I was protecting Douglas." "Stop it," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I just spoke 2 words, but they cut through her hysteria like a knife through silk. I stood up. I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of my mother. I was wearing my black suit. I felt tall. I felt solid. "You weren't protecting Douglas," I said. "And you certainly weren't protecting me. You were protecting your seat at the table." I looked her in the eye. I saw the fear there, but I also saw the stubborn, narcissistic refusal to admit she was wrong. "You told me there was no seat for disappointments," I said. "You removed my chair. You made me eat in the kitchen. You made me feel like I was a ghost in my own home because you were terrified that if anyone looked at me too closely, they would see him." I pointed at Wesley. "So I said to myself," I continued, my voice steady and cold, "that if you were going to remove my seat to keep your silence, then I was going to remove your silence to take back my seat." I turned to Gavin. "Execute the clause," I said. "Sadie, please," my mother begged. She grabbed my arm. Her grip was weak. You can't do this. Where will I go? That is my home. I have my garden club. I have my friends. You can't throw me on the street. You have a condo in Florida, I said, pulling my arm away. And you have a very generous settlement from the divorce that Douglas is about to file. You won't be on the street. Mother, you just won't be at 42 Oak Lane. That house belongs to the Livingston bloodline. And since Douglas is leaving, and Madeline has her own house, that leaves me. But you hate that house, Madeline piped up. You always said it was a museum. It is a museum, I said. It is a museum of lies, and I am going to be the curator who finally clears out the fake exhibits. Aunt Renee stood up then. She reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a yellowed envelope. There is one more thing, Renee said. Her voice was shaky, but she looked determined. Lillian wanted this read. She said to save it for the very end, in case Patricia tried to play the martyr. Renee unfolded the letter. My dearest family. Renee read, If you are hearing this, it means the truth is out. Patricia will tell you she did it for love. She will tell you she did it to save the marriage. But I want the record to show that on the night Sadie was born, Patricia told me she hoped the baby would be a girl, because girls are easier to mold. She told me that if the baby looked like Wesley, she would send it to boarding school. She never wanted a child. She wanted a prop. And when the prop started to have a personality, she started to punish it. The room was deadly silent. My mother sank into a chair. She didn't argue. She couldn't. The words of her dead mother-in-law had stripped her bare. Douglas stood up slowly. He walked over to me. He looked at Wesley. Then he looked at me. I am sorry, Douglas said. I know that word doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back the 33 years, but I want you to know. I loved you. Sadie. In my own broken way, I just loved my pride more. He reached out, as if to hug me, then dropped his hand. I chose a fake peace over a real daughter, he said, and I will have to live with that. Yes, I said. You will. I didn't hug him. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. Forgiveness is expensive, and he hadn't earned enough credit yet. Wesley stepped forward. I have money now, he said. Not a lot, but enough. I have a business in New York. I want to help. I want to pay for whatever you need. Therapy, a new car, a vacation. I want to be a father. Sadie. I looked at him. I looked at this stranger who shared my face. I felt a pull toward him, a biological magnetism, but I also felt a fierce, protective independence. I don't need money, I said. And I don't need a dad. I am 33 years old. Wesley, I raised myself. I picked up the signed deed that Gavin had placed on the table. I don't need a savior, I said. I don't need a man to come in at the last minute and define who I am. I just needed to know that I wasn't crazy. I needed the truth so I could write my own story. I looked at all of them, the shattered remains of the Livingston dynasty. I am keeping the house, I announced, but I am not living in it. I am going to sell it. I am going to take the money and I am going to start a foundation for children who don't have seats at their family tables. And the first thing I am going to do is hire a bulldozer to tear down that dining room. I turned and walked to the door. The meeting is adjourned, I said. 2 weeks later, the air in my apartment smelled of roasted pecans and cinnamon. It was a Thursday evening. I called it Friendsgiving. Though it wasn't Thanksgiving anymore, it was just a dinner. I had bought a new table. It was round. It was made of reclaimed wood, full of knots and imperfections, sturdy and honest. There were 8 chairs. I walked around the table placing the name cards. Aunt Renee, Lena Ashford, my colleague Brenda from work, Wesley. We were taking it slow. Coffee once a week, but he was trying. Douglas. He had asked to come. I had said yes, on the condition he brought the wine and didn't give a speech. Gavin Holt, a seat for myself, and 1 empty chair, not for a ghost, not for a fake baby, but for anyone who needed it, a chair for the unexpected. I walked to the oven and pulled out the pie. The crust was perfect, golden brown and flaky. The pecans were arranged in concentric circles, dark and sweet. I carried it to the table and set it down in the center. The doorbell rang. I could hear laughter in the hallway. I could hear Renee complaining about the stairs. I could hear Wesley asking Douglas about his golf game. An awkward but genuine attempt at bridging a 30-year gap. I stood by the table for a moment, looking at the scene. There was no tension. There was no performance. There was no fear that if I said the wrong thing, I would be banished to the kitchen. I touched the back of my chair. It was solid. It was mine. I smiled. "Come on in," I shouted toward the door. "The table is set." I looked at the empty space where the disappointment used to sit, and I saw only potential. "This time," I whispered to myself, "no one has the power to clear my place but me." Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below and let's get a conversation started. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, please make sure to subscribe to the Nina Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share these stories with even more people.